Welcome, 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 and thank you guys for joining us to close out our Black History Month for 2023. This is the NETwork National Black History Month Cafe Conversation Part 2 on our voters' rights. So this is a continued conversation on Voters' Rights Act from the inspired perspective of MLK Jr., presented by our special guest, Dr. Stephon Ferguson. We also have Abdul Donsumu, a young lawyer who will bring in his perspective as well, civil rights lawyer, should I say. The network chief operations officer, DeWanda Ricks, will be our moderator today. I am Gina McCrae, chief executive officer of the network, and we are excited. We welcome you. We thank you with our amazing speakers today. To kick us off, we're going to have Dr. Chloe Lamel, AT&T's AVP of Human Resources, to share with us some opening words. Dr. Chloe?
Thank you so much, Gina. I am so thrilled and delighted to be here providing opening remarks for the closing event of Black History Month. And I do want to apologize in advance for needing to step out after my opening remarks to head to my kids' Black History Month performance at their school. School switched it up on me and demade my day, and you just confirmed it, Gina, when you shared that this will be recorded so I can watch the replay of what I miss. And for those of you who know me, you know I identify as a mother who works. So seeing my kids who are representing the life and legacy of Barack Obama and Ketanji Brown Jackson today during their performance is incredibly important. So that said, what is also incredibly important today is this cafe conversation on voters' rights and the very special guest speakers we have who will share their thoughts on this topic. I want to, before we introduce those very special guests, I want to acknowledge the incredible work that the NETwork National has done over the course of Black History Month, aligning to the theme of the history of Black resistance, moving forward with possibilities. The network hosted 2 other cafe conversations, this one being a continuation, one at the outset of the month on our history and our legacy, and one on financial literacy. And additionally, to further promote employee well-being, the network hosted Mindful Mondays and Get Fit Fridays. I'm excited to report I ran my first marathon on Sunday. This was inspired in large part by this group, so thank you all for what you do. And then further, to give back to the community, the network hosted a United Negro College Fund Scholarship Telethon. So on behalf of AT&T and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team, thank you to the NETwork National for all you do to shine a light on underrepresented and historically excluded groups. Now, that said, without further ado, I want to turn it to DeWanda Ricks, who will be our moderator today, to get into the meat of today's discussion and to introduce our very special guests. Dee, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lamel. We appreciate your kind words. Now go see about your children and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for joining us on today. And right now, I want to take the time to introduce our speakers. First, I will introduce Dr. Stephon Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson, born in Albany, New York, is a native of Fayetteville, North Carolina, where he currently resides. I read that all wrong. Dr. Ferguson, born in Albany, New York, is a native of Fayetteville, North Carolina, where he currently resides. He travels across the country and the world, recreating the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and educating people on King's life and philosophy of love, peace, and justice. Recognized for his work with MLK, he has received 3 Presidential Volunteer Service Awards and was inducted into the Morehouse College MLK Board of Scholars in Atlanta. Ferguson is featured in the March 2nd, 2022 issue of Time magazine. He was selected by Time to play the role of Dr. King for a virtual reality traveling exhibit of the March on Washington. He is the only individual ever licensed by the King estate and family to perform the copyrighted words of King. Thank you, Dr. Ferguson, for being here with us. Do you have any opening remarks for our listeners today and viewers?
Just thank you for having me, and thank you for being a part of this wonderful event.
Thank you, sir. And next, we also have a phenomenal young man, Mr. Abdul Donsumu. Abdul is an attorney, activist, and leader who builds and scales movements to respond to the most pressing issues of our time. With over a decade of experience in strategizing for change and organizing for power, he has worked across sectors to catalyze positive impact in racial justice, civil rights, and equity. Abdul is the founder and chief strategist of the Young Black Lawyers Organization Coalition, a civic organizing network of young Black lawyers and law students dedicated to building power for Black communities, and a former appointee of President Barack Obama to the U.S. Department of Transportation. Abdul received his BA from the University of Chicago and his JD from NYU School of Law. Welcome, Mr. Abdul. Please, thank you for coming. Say a few words to our viewers on today.
Thank you so much, DeWanda. Thank you, Gina. Thank you to the entire team for convening this important conversation. And I am thrilled to be with all of you today. I'm coming to you live today from Chicago, where the weather is unseasonably warm. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm excited to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you. So on January 12th of 2023, we started the conversation during our MLK event, Together We Can Be the Dream. The cafe conversation centered on the Voters' Rights Act of 1965. This act, signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, aimed to overcome legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote as guaranteed under the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Voting Rights Act is considered one of the most far-reaching pieces of civil rights legislation in the U.S. history. We discussed how every vote matters. We discussed how we all can make a difference. Someone even stated that voting is like the bus system. The bus may not take you directly to your stop, but you get on the bus route that takes you as close to your stop as possible. We discussed the challenges for Black voters at the poll, but most importantly, we agree that knowledge is power, and there is power in numbers. Today, we will hear from Dr. Ferguson, recreating the words of Dr. King, and we will hear from a modern-day lawyer, Mr. Abdul Donsumu, to continue the conversation. Again, thank you both for being here. And Dr. Ferguson, I will start with you. From the perspective of Dr. King, what would you say about how far we've come from the Voters' Rights Act of 1965 to today's time?
Well, let me say again, thank you for having me. I'm certainly delighted to be here and to be a part of this great conversation, this cafe conversation. We know for many years there has been a struggle to gain the right to vote. I began with the civil rights movement that began in 1955 when a 42-year-old seamstress by the name of Rosa Parks decided that she wasn't going to take it any longer, and she stayed on a bus seat. She was arrested because segregation was the law of the land. And we decided to boycott the buses. 50,000 Black men and women of Montgomery, Alabama, refused absolutely to ride the city buses. And we walked together for 381 days. The Supreme Court of our nation rendered a decision that segregation in public transportation was unconstitutional. And we returned to the buses just a few days before Christmas of 1956 on a non-segregated basis. A few weeks later, we formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization that eventually grew to more than 85 affiliated organizations operating in every Southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. And we worked closely with these organizations to bring about the changes that were necessary. While at that time we did not have the right to vote, we used very strategic methods to gain the attention of the nation toward the injustices that we faced. Now, later that year in May of 1957, I delivered a speech at the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom there on the National Mall. It was the 3-year anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. Many of you are familiar with Brown versus Board of Education. That's when the Supreme Court of our nation rendered in really simple, eloquent, and unequivocal language a decision that has long been stenciled in the mental sheets of succeeding generations. This May 17th decision really came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of human captivity. And it came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves, millions of disinherited people throughout the world who had dared only to dream of freedom. But unfortunately, this noble and this sublime decision, it didn't go without opposition. But even more, all types of conniving methods were still being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters, from poll taxes to being asked to count the number of bubbles on a bar of soap or recite the Constitution. The denial of this sacred right was a tragic betrayal, I would say, of the highest mandates of our democratic tradition. And so in my message that day, our most urgent request to the President of the United States of America and every member of Congress really was to give us the right to vote. Give us the ballot. And that was the title of my speech that day. And I said, give us the ballot. And we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot. We will no longer plead to the federal government the passage of just laws. Give us the ballot, and we will transform the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. Give us the ballot, and we will fill our legislative halls with men and women of goodwill and send to the sacred halls of Congress men and women who will not sign a Southern manifesto because of their devotion to the manifesto of justice. Give us the ballot, and we will place judges on the benches of the South who will do justly, who will love mercy, and walk humbly with their God. And what we were simply saying was, give us the right to vote, and we will, with the power of our vote, elect men and women who love justice, peace, and equality. So our nonviolent protests to gain the right continued. While in 1956, we were with the bus boycott, it was in 1960, the worthwhile at a counter, lunch counter, students in Greensboro, North Carolina, the sit-in movement began. And that was for a right to eat at a lunch counter. And then in 1961, it was interstate travel, and we began working on a civil rights bill that would give us these rights. In 1963, we were in Birmingham, Alabama. And I was jailed there and wrote a letter responding to clergymen who had written a letter really that was published in the local newspaper. And it was saying that my being there was unwise and untimely. It was that summer of that year, 1963, that we marched on Washington, where I tried to tell America about a dream that I had had. But that next year, in 1964, the Civil Rights Bill was signed into law. But now this bill did not adequately address the right to vote. And I had brought this to the attention of the President Johnson at that time, who had just signed the Civil Rights Bill. And he did not feel that he could persuade Congress into signing another bill that protected our rights. So we began the voting rights campaign. Now, of course, Selma was the battleground for gaining the right to vote. It was 1965, and several demonstrations for voting rights had taken place there. And during one of the demonstrations, a young man by the name of Jimmy Lee Jackson, he was shot and killed by police while he was trying to protect his mother during one of the demonstrations. And it was then that we decided to march to Montgomery, thus the march from Selma to Montgomery. That was the state capital, and we wanted to make our voices heard. And so on March the 7th, a young man by the name of John Lewis, who is the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, known as SNCC, and a young man by the name of Hosea Williams led a march of about 600 people. And when they marched across that Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they got to the bottom of that other side, they were facing state troopers who demanded that they stop the march. And they stood there, and within seconds, the horror began. And it's known as Bloody Sunday. You are familiar with it. Many people were severely injured, and some were killed, and all while peacefully marching and fighting for the right to vote. Now, I was not there on that day, but I had been there earlier in the week, and I returned days later. We led another march, and I made sure that we got the legal permit that following week, and we set out on the march, being protected by some of the same police who weeks earlier had beaten us. And we could already see a change, and we marched for 5 days, about 10 miles a day. We camped out on the farms at night, and we finally got to the Capitol, where I delivered the speech, "How long, not long." Many people were asking the question, and so I responded to it in that speech. I said, "I know you're asking today, how long will it take? How long will prejudice blind the visions of men and darken their understanding and drive bright-eyed wisdom from her sacred throne? Somebody's asking, when will wounded justice, lying prostrate on the blood-flowing streets of Selma and Birmingham and communities all across the South, be lifted from this dust of shame to reign supreme among the children of men? Somebody was asking, when will the radiant star of hope be plunged against the nocturnal bosom of this lonely night, plucked from weary souls with chains of fear, manacles of death? How long will justice be crucified and truth buried? I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed to earth will rise again. How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because you shall reap what you sow. How long? Not long, truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future. Behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch above his own. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And that was in March. And 5 months later, in August of 1965, the Voting Rights Bill was signed into law. The Voting Rights Act was enacted on August the 6th, of course, 1965, and it prohibited states from imposing qualifications or practices to deny the right to vote on account of racial or race, or permitted direct federal intervention in the electoral process in certain places. It based a coverage formula, and it required pre-clearance of these new laws and covered states' jurisdictions to ensure that they did not have the purpose, nor did they have the effect of denying the right to vote on account of race, among many other provisions. And so shortly following that, Black voter registration and participation really increased very dramatically. Now, I've always said that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined legal and nonviolent pressure. See, your vote is a form of nonviolence, but beyond that, we must hold those whom we elect accountable to write laws that are just. So while our vote is extremely important, John Lewis would say that it's almost sacred. It is just as important that we hold those who we vote for accountable. Now, our whole campaign in Alabama has been centered around the right to vote. And see, when focusing our attention of the nation and the world on the flagrant denial of the right to vote, we are really exposing the very origin, the very root cause of racial segregation in the Southland. Now you see, and many people feel, but racial segregation as a way of life didn't come about as a natural result of hatred between the races. Immediately following the Civil War, there weren't any laws. There were no laws segregating the races. And as the noted historian C. Van Woodard in his book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, he clearly points out that segregation of the races was really a political stratagem employed by the emergent urban interests in the South to keep the Southern masses divided and the Southern labor the cheapest in the land. And so toward the end of Reconstruction era, something very significant happened. And that is what is known as the populist movement. And so the leaders of this movement began awakening the poor white masses and the former Negro slaves to the fact that they were really being fleeced by the emergent urban interests. And not only that, but they began uniting Blacks and white in masses into voting blocks. And see, what happened is this threatened to drive the urban interests from their command post of political power there in the South. So to meet this threat, they began to immediately engineer this development of a segregated society. And, you know, I want you to follow me through here, because this is very important to see the roots of the denial of the right to vote. Now, through their controlled mass media, they revised the doctrine of white supremacy, and then they directed the placement on the books of the South of laws that made it a crime for Blacks and whites to come together as equals at any level. And that did it. That really did it. That crippled and eventually destroyed the populist movement of the 19th century. And so thus the threat of free exercise of the ballot by the Negro and the white masses alike resulted in the establishment of a segregated society. Did you know that? This is what happened when Black and white masses of the South threatened to unite and build a great society, a society of justice, where none would prey upon the weakness of others, a society of plenty, where greed and poverty would be done away with, a society of brotherhood, where every man and every woman would respect the dignity and the worth of human personality. And we have to understand that we are living in, not in Black or white states of America, not in the Democratic or Republican states of America, not in the conservative or liberal states of America, but we are living in the United States of America. The arc of the moral universe is long, but I certainly believe that it bends towards justice and equality for all of God's children. So the right to vote has been a struggle. There are many people who sacrificed their lives so that those who came after them would have the freedom that many have today. Your vote is the most important tool that you can use to bring about the necessary changes that will make this nation a better nation and bring about true justice for all of God's children. Voting is essential, and it really, really makes a difference. You know, I recall a mission that we had to double the number of Negro registered voters, North and South. And I was convinced that if we could increase the number of registered voters, that we would be able to change the political climate of the South. Now, at this time, there were about 10 million Negroes. Of that number, almost 6 million were eligible to vote. At least they were voting age. and yet only 1.5 million were registered to vote. So we understood that, and we could see that there was a big job ahead of us. And I understood that whenever Negroes were voting in large numbers, you could see a difference in the climate as it relates to race relations. And I think of my own city of Atlanta, Georgia, and we worked for a long, long time there seeking to obtain the right to vote. And you know, the Black vote became a force in Atlanta with almost 50,000 Negroes registered to vote. This meant that no mayor could be elected in Atlanta without the Black vote. This meant that no aldermen could be elected in Atlanta. And it really made a difference. And I remember then when the then mayor, a man of goodwill, I'm convinced, was running for governor several years ago, and he was a segregationist. And he talked about the eternality of segregation. But then when he started running for mayor, he started talking about integration. And somebody asked him one day, well, why did you change your mind? He said, well, I've seen the light now. Well, I guess 50,000 votes will make anybody see the light. But thank God that we continue to delve deep into this work to make justice a reality for all of God's children. And you know, the voting rights advocates of today stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. And I could not talk about voting rights without talking about Mrs. Ida B. Wells, who was born into slavery, was one of the early leaders of the civil rights movement. She was a journalist. She led an anti-lynching crusade. She fought for women's rights. And she also did a number of things that faced discrimination within the suffrage movement. And I would be remiss if I did not, and I can't talk about voting rights without mentioning Fannie Lou Hamer. She was born in 1917, and Hamer became a prominent voice in the civil rights movement and the Voting Rights Act movement. She was a student at the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Hamer led voter registration movements across the country. And she co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964. And that year, Hamer helped organize Freedom Summer. That was a mobilizing effort that brought college students together to help with Black registration down in the South. And so, my friends, it was a long struggle, and we understand that the struggle continues, but we are able to our tireless efforts. We were able to get both the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act signed into law, passed in Congress. And while we saw significant changes in America, we realized that there was still much work to be done. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so very much. There's still much work to be done. And in fact, Mr. Donsumu, I would love for you to talk about the Voters' Rights Act. Dr. King spoke on give us the ballot, right? And our most important thing to do is to vote, and we got to hold those accountable. So tell us why you're in Chicago and what you're doing and how we can protect our right to vote.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, let me just articulate how difficult and how challenging it is to come behind the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. So beautifully spoken today. And it's an intimidating proposition, but I'm going to do my best. I am honored to stand on the shoulders of so many giants who have gone before us in this struggle, in this continuum of resistance to voter suppression in this country. Dr. King, John Lewis, Fannie Lou Hamer, Amelia Boynton is a name that we don't mention often enough, but who was a major force in the Selma movement. I will actually be in Selma this weekend for the 58th anniversary of the march, the Selma March, Bloody Sunday, which was a moment, and I start here because I think it's important. It was a moment in time as Dr. Ferguson has so richly articulated, in which there was tremendous resistance to the idea of a Voting Rights Act, right? The Voting Rights Act was in effect dead on arrival in the United States Congress, and the president was resisting calls to bring it up. Dr. King and fellow leaders in the movement meet with President Johnson in the White House, and they advocate for the Voting Rights Act bill. What's interesting about that moment is President Johnson says to Dr. King, you know, I don't have the power to do this. I don't have the power to do this right now. And that's where he thought the meeting had ended. But Dr. King, as he's walking out of the White House with his colleagues and comrades, says, you know, the president says he doesn't have any power to do this. And they said, well, what are we going to do, Dr. King? And Dr. King says, well, we've got to go and get the president some power. And it's a crystallizing moment that I think is worth kicking off my portion of this conversation, because it reminds us what I think we need to remember in this moment, which is that the power of the people is always greater than that of the people in power. And right now, there are a number of forces across the country that are aiming to undermine the right to vote. So let me start with where we left off, which is the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Voting Rights Act is passed, as Dr. Ferguson has already articulated. There was a key provision in that bill, and I want to make sure we understand this. That provision was Section 5, number of key provisions, but the most important was Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which is known as pre-clearance review. And what pre-clearance review says is that any state with a history of voter suppression in their laws and policies must pre-clear any and all changes to their voting laws and policies by the United States Justice Department. So this was an effort to institute a federal check on states that had a history of voter suppression. So we're talking about most of the southern states at that time, right? And so what happens is that these states are prohibited from making any changes that they have not pre-cleared by the Justice Department. And that tool is the tool that opens the possibility for inclusive democracy. And we see that flowering over the course of the 5 decades since then, right? If you are someone who has looked at the election of Black mayors in the 1970s, if you are someone who has celebrated the expansion of the Congressional Black Caucus in the Congress, if you're someone who has looked around and seen history being made in the form of first Black governor or first Black senator or first Black president, then you have the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to thank for that. You have the pre-clearance provision in particular to thank for that, right? Because that is the mechanism by which more voices were added to our democracy. But I think it's important for us to understand, and this gets to the sort of continuum of struggle. It's important for us to understand that although the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the law of the land, and although it was regularly reauthorized by bipartisan majorities in Congress and signed by presidents of both parties, it's important for us to understand that lurking just beneath the surface has always been a kind of quiet, far-right opposition to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And quietly, just below the surface, those forces were organizing and they were fundraising for movements, and they were elevating lawyers into judicial appointments, right? And they were running candidates for office. And their entire objective was to disentangle the Voting Rights Act of 1965, because they understood what we must understand, which is that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is the tool that makes for inclusive democracy. And inclusive democracy is the tool that allows for a more equitable America. And the forces who are opposed to that understand it. Those of us who support a more equitable America must understand it as well, right? So they were organizing. And in 2013, the Supreme Court of the United States issued a decision called Shelby County v. Holder. And I promise I won't make this law school class, but Shelby County v. Holder essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965 of that pre-clearance requirement. So what the Supreme Court said was, at least this was their pretext. They said, we've made so much progress that we no longer need the pre-clearance requirement. These states have made so much progress on race that they no longer need to be held to account for the efforts that they make to restrict the vote. And so the Supreme Court in 2013 essentially decimated the core provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And almost overnight, we saw states across the country, many of the southern states that were previously under the pre-clearance requirement, almost overnight, we saw those states start to enact new voter suppression laws and policies. Almost overnight, we saw those states enact discriminatory ID laws. Almost overnight, we saw those states start to close polling locations with a disparate impact on communities of color. So DeWanda mentioned that I'm traveling today, but I've been working on an issue in my home state of Texas. In Texas, a legislator has proposed a bill that would close polling locations, would eliminate polling locations on college campuses. All right, would eliminate polling locations on college campuses. Now, if you know anything about the 26th Amendment to the US Constitution, right, you know that that amendment says that the right to vote cannot be denied or abridged based on age, right? And so we believe this is a blatant attempt to disenfranchise young voters. It's a blatant attempt to deny the right to vote to a rising to a population that is rising in political influence, particularly in the last several elections, right? And so we are fundamentally opposed to that. We often say this: in order to have a right to vote, you must have a site to vote. You must have a site to vote. And this legislation would eliminate critical sites to vote for young people in particular across the state of Texas. So we are opposing that, and I've been working on that just today. But it's important for us to understand that the reason that is possible is that the Supreme Court has basically given carte blanche to states to do whatever they want to do, to pass any kinds of voting laws that they want to pass. And we've seen them take advantage of that. Over the course of the last 2 years, we have seen some 440 voter suppression bills proposed in 48 states across the country. 440 voter suppression bills proposed in 48 states across the country. And so that is the landscape right now that we are facing. We are facing a world in which we no longer have federal oversight of voting. And because we no longer have federal oversight of voting, states have been unleashed to enact any kind of voter suppression law and policy that effectively that they want to enact. And it is wreaking havoc on voters. It is wreaking havoc on our democratic system. So I'll just give you a couple of cases in point. In Texas, again, it's a big frame of reference for me because I'm from there. We work there. We also work in several other states, and we're a national organization, but Texas is very close to home. So in Texas, during the March 22 presidential primary, that was the first, the March 22 primary for the midterm elections that just passed. That was the first election in which there were new rules for voting by mail. So if you'll go back to 2020 during the pandemic, right? What we saw was an explosion in voting by mail. Why? Because we were dealing with a global pandemic and people were afraid to get out and afraid to go to the polls. And communities of color in particular were being disproportionately impacted by that pandemic, right? And so voters of color who were not traditionally proponents of voting by mail, voters of color tend to like to go and see the ballot dropped in the box, right? Historically, voters of color had not taken much advantage of vote by mail. All of a sudden, you see an explosion in voters of color using vote by mail, and other voters, elderly voters, younger voters, really any category of voters where they were taking advantage of vote by mail, right? And so in reaction to that, across the country, you saw states now say, oh, well, we've got to rein in vote by mail. Vote by mail is a problem. We've got to rein it in. And so they started enacting all of these layers of complication to the vote by mail process just to confuse people and make it harder, right? So Texas was one of those states. Texas actually did not expand vote by mail in the way that other states did. Texas, kept it pretty limited in 2020. But they said, you know what, we're going to enact even more limits on vote by mail. And so they passed this requirement that said the ID number, the ID number that you include on your vote by mail ballot application and your vote by mail completed ballot must match your voter registration record. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is if you are someone who registered to vote decades ago, you may not remember what form of ID you used to register to vote, right? So if you go and you put down the last 4 digits of your social security number, but in fact, you registered with another ID, your ballot gets rejected. All right. And so what happened in that election is that we saw one of the highest vote by mail ballot rejection rates in Texas history. All right. And so it's important for us to see the ways in which we're not just sounding the alarm about some theoretical threat. We are sounding the alarm about an actual threat that is wreaking havoc with voters on the ground in our communities. I'll give you another example. Georgia passed a whole omnibus voter suppression bill. Many of you heard about some of the prohibitions that were in that bill. And Georgia, in the 2022 primary, had the largest Black-white turnout gap in history. One of the largest Black-white turnout gaps in history in Georgia in that election. And that was a direct consequence, right, of some of these new provisions that were enacted. And so I think it's important for us to see the ways in which these provisions are actually inhibiting the right to vote on the ground. And so when I talk about the work that I do, right, and that my organization does, we are about organizing the Black legal community to oppose these voter suppression laws and policies. And we do it through the ways that you would traditionally understand is the role for the lawyer, right? We have sued states, we have filed amicus briefs in other cases. We are part of that group of lawyers and who have helped to drive that legal fight against voter suppression forward, right? But we also do it in a way that I think is equally important. And that is that we are building a movement, an army, so to speak, of lawyers and law students, Black lawyers and law students, to go across the country and educate our communities about the vote, about the importance of political participation, and about how to protect their vote, right? And so in the last election that just passed, we deployed teams of 100 Black lawyers across the country to states like Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas. We fully funded Black lawyers and law students to travel from their cities into places like Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas to do this kind of organizing work in the community, right? And so we had law students, Black law students from Howard, from NYU, from Columbia, from SMU, from UNT Dallas College of Law. And they gave up the time in their busy schedules to travel with us. We paid for their lodging and their flights and their food and their ground transportation and everything so that they could be on the ground in our communities, not just filing the lawsuits, right? Not just helping out on the election protection side, which is what traditionally where people want to slot the lawyers, but more importantly, and equally importantly, on the ground, being on the ground, talking to voters about the value of the ballot, about how Black ballots are Black futures, talking to low civic engagement voters, voters who are skeptical of the political process, voters who say, why should I vote? It hasn't done anything for our communities. Those are the voters we want to talk to. And we want to engage them in a conversation, in a discourse that recognizes that the vote isn't perfect. Our democratic system isn't perfect. Elections are not perfect. But the way you fix the system is not to disengage. The way you fix the system is to engage, right? And talking to them not just about that, but about the vision that they have for their communities, right? We often say, I do quote Gil Scott-Heron that says the revolution will not be televised. But what we say to folks is the revolution is going to have to be legislated. It's going to have to be signed into law by some mayor or some governor or some president. And we have to be at the table. We have a member that says, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. And our communities in many ways have often been on the menu, right? And not at the table. And so our work is to make sure that we're talking to folks about the value of being at the table and then working to make sure that they have the tools and resources that they need to successfully cast their ballot and ensure that that ballot is successfully counted. So we go in and we talk to them. Okay, here are the things you need to know to protect your ballot. They've got all of these voter suppression laws and policies that are aiming to stop you. Here's what you need to know to resist that. We want to be a community-based bulwark against voter suppression and against voter depression, because I think we're dealing with two forms of challenge here. We're dealing with voter suppression and we're dealing with voter depression, right? We're dealing with a system that has not responded to the needs of communities of color consistently, right? And voters who are despondent about that, depressed about that, demobilized by that they are not wanting to be part of the process. We've got to deal with both of these fights. And that is the work that we do at the Young Black Lawyers Organizing Coalition. And we stand on the shoulders of giants. And I'm honored to be in that struggle and in that fight. I'll just close with this. Thurgood Marshall, that legal lion of the 20th century, who everybody will know as the force behind Brown versus the Board of Education, which is, the seminal legal case of the 20th century. Thurgood Marshall argued a case in 1944 called Smith versus Allwright. Now, not law school class, but Smith versus Allwright was the case that outlawed the whites only primary in the state of Texas, right? And Thurgood Marshall teams up he finds a plaintiff who is a Black dentist in Houston, in 3rd Ward, Houston, Texas. And they take this case all the way to the Supreme Court, and they win the case. And Thurgood Marshall said that case, not Brown, but that case was his most important case. And the reason he said that case was his most important case is that he understood what my main message is here today, and my main message everywhere I go is, which is that if we can get democracy right, we have a chance to get all the other issues right. But if we don't get democracy right, we have no chance to get everything else right. And so it is on us to make sure we get democracy right. Thank you so much.
Powerful. Thank you so much. I was just jotting down so many notes, and just powerful.
Absolutely.
Thank you both. And now, if you could sum up and say 10 words or less, Mr. Abdul, why should people vote?
People should vote because your vote is an expression of your hopes and dreams for this country. Your vote is an expression of your hopes and dreams for this country, for your state, and for your community.
Awesome. Now, for those of us that listen to you and we're saying to ourselves, how do we get involved? How do we spread the word? How do we help with impacting and protecting our right to vote?
So I think there are so many ways. I mean, the first is everybody on this call should make sure that you vote, number one, right? To make sure that you are educated about the vote, that you are educated about who you're voting for, that you take voting seriously. And then the second thing that I would encourage everybody to do is become an ambassador for voting in your families and communities. That's the simplest thing we can all do, is become an ambassador to our families and our communities. Talk to them about the importance of voting. And if you need resources to help educate friends and family about this, make sure that you're plugged into our organization, yblock.org. ybloc.org is our website. Young Black BLK Lawyers on social media is the handle for following us. You can get a lot of information there. You can get information from other trusted organizations, and I do emphasize trusted organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, Under Law. So many resources out there, but make sure you're taking the vote seriously and make sure you are an ambassador for voting in your family and communities.
Thank you. Now, Dr. King, before we leave, we have one question for you.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. So the question is, so I would like for Dr. Ferguson as MLK to speak about the importance of Bayard Rustin. If you could speak about his work.
Oh, wow. That's a very, Bayard Rustin was a great man. And certainly it was Bayard Rustin who really put the gatherings, the March on Washington. He galvanized individuals and really had a great part to do with that. In fact, there is a movie that is going to be coming out, I understand, that is called Rustin. I think it's Rustin or Bayard, and it's being produced by our first president, our first Black president, Barack Obama, Michelle Obama. They were going to be putting this movie out because many people don't really know about Bayard Rustin. But he was a great individual who really helped. He was in the backgrounds a lot, but he was very significant in the work that we were doing to bring about justice. So without going into very detailed context, I would say certainly go to the movie.
Thank you so very much. Now, in just a few words, Dr. King, can you tell us why it's important to vote?
Well, it's certainly important to vote because what we have to understand is we were talking about laws, and there are two types of laws. There are just laws and unjust laws. Now, I'd be the first to advocate obeying just laws because one has not only a moral but a legal responsibility to obey just laws. But conversely, one has should disobey unjust laws. And so I think that it is the context of the unification, the importance is because these laws are made by individuals who are in office, and our vote is dependent upon those who are elected. And so it is very essential that we vote for people who are willing to take a stand for justice, because if we don't, then we'll have individuals who make laws that are not in line with where we're going. And so it's extremely important to go out and vote. But not only is it important to register to vote and to vote, but once you have voted and elected these individuals, it's just as important to make sure that we hold them accountable. Because we can have all kind of people in office and they can do what they want to do. But if we hold them accountable, the people hold them accountable, then certainly, and if you don't vote, you don't have a voice. Your vote is your voice.
I love it. Your vote is your voice. And now we will have our Madam CEO close us out. Thank you both so much for joining us. I thoroughly enjoyed you, learned a lot, and that means a lot. Thank you so much. Ms. McCray?
Thank you, thank you. Well, I have certainly learned my lesson. I shall not try to come behind these two great men. And with all the information they have shared today, I really think we need to sit with that and get about our action, right? I think one of our executive advisors, Angela Baskerville, said it's time to be about the business of the business. So I want to thank everybody for coming today. I want to thank you all for being a part of our entire Black History Month celebration over the various events that Dr. Chloe mentioned earlier today. We are just grateful and humbled to have our two guests here with us today. Great to meet you, Abdul, and always a pleasure. Stephon, we love having you, and Abdul, we look forward to having you back again for sure. You're in it now. We we got you. We got you for sure.
Appreciate
but for our viewers that have joined us today, of course, we have one more action item for you all, and that is to please take a moment to take our survey. I'm going to also post it in the chat. You can click on the QR code, of course. Scan the QR code or click on the link in the chat. But we are so appreciative for you guys taking this hour to spend with us. And we're going to give you about 30 seconds of rollover back. So have a great rest of the week. Happy Black History Month. And we'll see you next time.